So thank you everyone for being here and for being invited to speak and coming across from the United States. It's been wonderful to be with you. So my job was to do a little bit of a setup here about the new pathways and new evidence. What do we need? And of course that gets into, well, why does it matter and how did we get there in the first place? So I'll try to do a little bit of all of that. First, a little background on NewDigs. We in essence bring together many different stakeholders in a safe haven environment to talk about these kinds of issues and try to build some consensus. And we share and disseminate those results through some papers, but also the relationships that are built from those safe haven discussions. And we like to think that the kind of papers we've done on the left with a cast of many on the authorship also then lead to some action, as we've seen with adaptive licensing. We like to think we played some role there, and hans-georg lets us get away with believing that anyway. So we thank him for that. But let's talk about a bit of why does MAPS and adaptive licensing really matter, and can it increase from a patient standpoint access, and what might that mean, and what are some of the other issues? And here, Zelboraf is an example which many of you know very well as a BRAF inhibitor that in essence was an adaptive licensing approach. It was not accelerated approval in the United States. It was a shortened phase 3 trial with some phase 2 evidence, and it was simply approved a couple years early. The result of that, compared to if they had been forced to continue with the phase 3 trial, was about 9,000 extra patient years were served. That's how many more patients were there. On average, those patients live 9 to 12 months longer, so that's about 9,000 patient life years that were added through that kind of aggressive approach. That's that blue space on this between the adaptive and the other. You're going to see a bunch of charts go flying by. Think of this as a Monet exhibit. You're supposed to get impressions as you go through, but we're not going to go into the detail. This has all been mostly published work, and I can talk to you about the details afterwards. So a second case scenario that we did in the paper that one also came from was about Gilenya, which is a multiple sclerosis drug. So the classic approach was you approve it for everybody in multiple sclerosis. We said, well, what if you did it only for the severe and moderate population first, and then move forward into an all-comers sort of multiple sclerosis engagement? And then we said, how might that have affected safety discovery signals? Because if you recall, Gilenya now has a warning for cardiovascular. And in the traditional approach, the bottom right triangle over here with the blue line, we had to expose about 16,000 patients to that cardiovascular risk before it was recognized with today's systems to pick up on that kind of adverse event. Phase 3 trial was too small to detect this. This had to happen through real-world data. If we'd gone with a more adaptive approach where you might have said you'd had less evidence, but you gave it to this high-benefit population of moderate and severe first, we postulated, and some of the math seems to bear out, we would have only exposed about 8,000 lives to that. Statistically, we think we would have detected the signal. 18 months is about as fast as these processes can work. So the fact that Gilenya wound up with the warning in 18 months was probably about as fast as any of these organizations could really move through that of detecting, validating the signal, and then taking action on it. But if we'd gone through an adaptive approach, not only would you have had more patients, that difference between the purple and the blue line, gain access to this, but you would have actually, despite the supposed greater uncertainty that we've heard about, in reality, fewer patients would have realized the cardiovascular risk without knowing about it. So in this case, an adaptive licensing or MAPS approach not only gave more access, but actually reduced realized risk as opposed to some theoretical risk that they might have been done. In reality, it would have been smaller. Now let's talk about Acomplia. Those of you who are in the EU may recall this anti-obesity drug, a weight loss drug, which was issued and then withdrawn from the marketplace. Primary care drug. You heard Hans-Georg talk emphatically that this was really about tertiary sorts of care. I make an argument here in these case studies that you'll see it could also apply to primary care drugs in a very important way of preserving access. So with Acomplia, you had the challenge that those with psychiatric condition of depression and those sorts of things, schizophrenia, should not have this drug prescribed for them. For those of you who don't know, the rates of depression in obesity patients range upwards of high as 40%. You got nearly a 1 out of 2 chance of not being eligible for this drug, but that's not how it was prescribed. What you see here on this impressionistic chart is the green line is the total patients exposed. The red line are those who got the drug who probably shouldn't have. If you look at the data, more patients with psychiatric background actually got the drug than those who were appropriately prescribed. That led to a lot of, you might presume, psychiatric adverse events. The drug was then withdrawn within a couple years. But what if the world didn't have to work that way? What if instead you took the actual development program, but we imposed that after a reasonable time for this, call it 3 years, we then reviewed the process and to see whether more or less patients should be access to drug, and that during that time we have very strong controls and monitoring and support for patients and physicians to use the drug appropriately, and that pharma, for the sake of the economics on this, bears the cost of that. All right? So instead, you'll see here, at the beginning, the green line grows, the blue line's right underneath it, and the red line from this sort of idealized model, no one gets inappropriately prescribed because we have very strict controls. Say payers or physician management groups have to approve every patient beforehand, make sure that there's strong controls on electronic medical records, that anyone with a psychiatric background, cannot have it. You can think of a million different ways you could implement such strict controls. That wasn't the point of this. It was to say, what if it happened? And then, after 3 years, you said, we think we understand how to use this drug. We took off the controls, and all of a sudden, lots of patients get, again, inappropriately treated. Well, one response then, after another 3-year cycle, would be withdraw the drug, right? Just as we did before, but at least we got some use out of it appropriately for a few years. But what if instead we said, let's just reimpose the controls? We did it once. We let it sort of go laissez-faire. That did not work. Let's put the controls back on. What you could then have is an obesity drug that really delivers value for those for whom it's appropriately used, still being available and having patients have access to a treatment, but making sure that patients who are not appropriate for it still continue to be excluded from that population. The world would be a better place if we could pull off something close to that. Of course, you would never come out truly as that cleanly through all of it. And if you do it really well and you had great patient support, you may not need the controls going forward because the medical community and the patient communities will now understand and truly know how to use this drug. And you don't need the kind of draconian mother may I kinds of controls on the front end because now the community understands how best to use this drug and it just works very well. So those are some approaches. What does that mean for patient access? Well, this little vector chart on the left-hand side where the origin is the base case and then the different scenarios or the endpoints of the vectors say you get more appropriately treated patients having access, and while you do get more inappropriate treatment, the ratio between the two is outrageously large. Right? We could really have used this drug in a primary care setting if we'd have the right kinds of monitoring and real-world data systems and the feedback mechanisms. There was talk about risk management approaches in the first session. If we truly could execute on those, we could really preserve value, not only for specialty drugs, but for primary care drugs that have large populations for whom they shouldn't be given, but have many more patients who could benefit. That would be exciting. Oh, and by the way, sponsors, the drug developers actually wind up making better money off that because it's usually better to have your drugs on market than not, and it's better to have a payment move forward with patients. So these are vectors for both the Accomplia case study, but also the Galenia and the Zelbaroff studies. But it doesn't always work. You'll see some of those vectors go below the x-axis, right? So this is not a panacea. It does not always work in all situations. It is complex, as you've heard people talking about. So what have we shown so far? That early patient access and maps can be effective for some therapeutics. We've done the natural experiments, particularly in oncology. We think, through some of the simulation work we've done, maps and adaptive licensing could reduce real exposure to risk despite the supposed increased uncertainty. If you have the real-world data monitoring systems, we have that kind of way to not only gather the data, but also then take action on that data. And then finally, we could have the wonderful case where we preserve access to drugs that otherwise in today's world we withdraw. And those withdrawals are usually tragedies for patients who could have benefited from them, but because of the abuses of some, don't have access to that treatment anymore. All right? But let's talk about a couple more of the other issues that then raise up, having quickly run through that. So the high cost of the data can, of course, destroy the value. You can read the slide, but basically it says, gee, if it costs too much to monitor and charge, it destroys the economics for everybody. That's fairly straightforward and to understand, all right? So it needs some economies of scale. But in addition to that, there may be some room on this reimbursement issue that we heard. So let's take Gilenya as a prototype, not to make any aspersions or have anyone who in the room who's the sponsor of this drug think I'm going to destroy their business model here in the next 5 minutes, all right? But take that as an example for a specialty drug. If you take the baseline with the historic approach and call that 100%, if you then do the adaptive approach that I showed before, where you had fewer patients exposed to the actual risk, but more patients gained access, the pharmaceutical company net present value goes up by 37%, hits 137%. Should all of that go to the pharma company? Well, you could argue that maybe they just charge 12.5% less for that entire period. So the price goes down by 12.5%. They get more years on the marketplace. They could afford a 12.5% discount and still get the same net present value, the same return to their investors, the same economics writ large could occur, right? On the other hand, you could see that the adaptive licensing could be free for the first 2 years until you hit that full approval. And then they got the full price that they got before, right? So instead of giving a discount, they gave it for free for the year or two in sort of a contingent approval approach. Then they get the full price that they would have gotten otherwise. They still wind up making more money. For those of you who are thinking, how does that math work? It's because they're faster on the adoption curve for 2 years. They've been allowed to market and promote for 2 years, and therefore their peak sales they get to sooner, and that extra couple years earlier makes a difference. Speed counts, timing counts on these things. But there are ways you can imagine that everyone could win or come out about equal on this thing going forward. So now we have the challenge of the orphan diseases that we heard. We heard these $400,000 numbers just a moment ago, right? That scientific advances seem to be orphanizing every disease we take a look at. Whether it's oncology, now it's moving into autoimmune, people expect metabolic, schizophrenia is now talking about going in this direction. So fast development times tend to mitigate all this. If you can get products to market sooner at lower development cost, you don't need to make as much revenue to pay your investors back if you're the sponsors, so you can get that flow through and things go through. But let's take a look at a large oncology drug. Let's say to sponsor NPV on a model, we've published this in a different paper, quoted at the bottom, makes $1 billion off that. If you stratify it, you wind up with only 70,000 patients. It only makes $100 million at that point from an NPV. It gets to be marginal if you know that business. Anything under $100 million expected net present value gets to be a problem. And then if you go to a very small population of only 7,000 patients, which is about as big as brain cancer, for example, many of the small cancer subsegments are like this today, you actually lose money on this. This is something that would never survive a portfolio review process with a venture capitalist or a large company either way. All right? So let's extend the patent life. That's often what people say. If I could only have 40 years instead of 20 years, doesn't make any difference, because when you discount the revenues from year 40 back at 11%, it just doesn't make any difference on the decision at the time of whether you pursue the project or not. Of course, in year 23, you're really happy to have the extra patent life, but at the time of decision making to move the project forward, doesn't make much difference. But what if I do it faster? What if instead of taking $400 million in 7 years, I can do it in 4 years and $200 million, which for those of you who know oncology is close to what some of the best drugs there are now doing. Well, that almost makes it break even. If you want to actually bring it back to where you'd move forward, you'd have to do it from 3 years for $150 million and get a 90% market share, basically exclusivity for a 7,000 patient small market. Those are pretty daunting ways to do that, particularly if you do it all with random controlled trials and you want full evidence packages for reimbursement and those sorts of things. That's a really tall order. But if we do some of the adaptive licensing approaches, it could be possible, right? We've seen that. And for those of you who wonder why drugs cost $60,000, because if you can do it in 4 years with $200 million, you get a 6-year adoption, and instead of $20,000 for the price, which is what we assumed in all the above bars, you charge $60,000 for the drug, all of a sudden it becomes a financially viable project for pharma. So those of you who wonder why these small market oncology products cost $60,000, this is why. It's It's the only way that the numbers work. They don't work at $20,000 and they don't work at 2. So you could do that on a few punitively, but no one would ever develop another drug in that area. So it's pay me now or pay me later through all these things. So we have new pathways that are really connecting a number of things together. And what we've been doing with the Janus initiative is saying, how do we bring everyone together so that we satisfy all? An economic term meaning that everybody's sort of okay, but nobody's really thrilled. But at least they all move forward together through all this. So we're bringing them together. We put it through a process of some data discovery, and then we do a couple workshops, and we do some modeling of options. We do some other things to quantify that, and we move it from a situation of the person with the longest laundry list of issues wins, which is sort of how some of these conferences go, to those who can actually quantify and show that their issues matter win. A very important pivot on this, to put some quantification behind it. And it's very important that with adaptive licensing, with these new approaches, we're changing everything from clinical trial approaches to reimbursement approaches to regulatory approaches. We normally talked about those separately. If we don't talk about them together, we can't make progress. But we also believe at MIT if we don't quantify them together in a transparent way that we all believe that we can understand each other's positions, we don't really know what makes sense to pursue and what doesn't. To the point that was asked by Pfizer before, if we don't put some quantification to winnow the number of issues to only the critical ones, we'll have thousands of questions at the end of the day and we'll never get anywhere because we can't answer that many questions all at once. And to give you a sense of how this is so important to look at them together, this is from a very early paper from 4 or 5 years ago. We could take $1 billion drugs, and if we changed 9 factors, the cost of development, the time of development, the reimbursement rate, the adoption speed of whether physicians adopted in 5 years or 6 years, change them all just by 25% to the worse, you can make $1 billion positive NPV project a $300 million loser. If, however, they all also only improve by 25%, I can turn it into a $1 billion nirvana winner. 25% changes. Very small changes, but they compound, they multiply through the supply chain. That's why we have to look at these things together, not isolated one at the other. And if you actually run all the combinatorials and add in a couple other factors, you get beautiful curves like this whose impression for you is there's more red and yellow than blue, but the blue stretches out for a long time. The benefits of collaboration are in the long blue tail. If we all optimize locally, we wind up in the red and the yellow through all that. That's what the numbers wind up saying. And so what we've done through Janus looks complicated, but basically what you have is if you can visually compare and bring together people's perspectives on the data and the risk, they look like heat maps. You're right, it's bioinformatics applied to policy decision making, right? You get nerds together, this is what happens, all right? And then you also connect that to the evidence, and that the evidence has to be connected to actions. You can't just change a factor, you have to say, I'm actually going to do a trial differently. Right? And how do I then simulate that trial? That's what all the little circle stuff in the middle, linked set of models from clinical trial simulations to financial models. And then at the end, we take a look through Janus at each stakeholder's perspective, not just the patient's perspective, not just the drug developers, but societies, the public health perspective. Everybody gets their window on the same transparent set of assumptions and data and numbers. And then we tell stories. This is not about an optimal answer, which I have to keep telling my people in the OR group. This is not about an optimization problem. This is about telling stories with some quantification and some meat so that the real decision makers, the real influencers can play, can have a sense of what if. What if we behaved this way versus that way? Would it work for me? Would it work for you? What would those stories look like? This is quantified storytelling, sort of creative writing with numbers through all this, but done with some rigor that we might believe some of the answers coming out. That's part of what Hans-Georg was talking about. And so the final slide, patient first, but no one last. So we all agree the patients have to come out as winners on this, but if anyone loses, whether that be a payer, a sponsor, a clinician, then the drug won't make it to that patient. So no one can lose, no one can be last, expected to take one for society. We all have to come out reasonably well on this, and we think through adaptive licensing there's new ways to make everybody win, and through some of the analysis tools we've put together in analyses like this, we hope it spurs the conversation, and I hope that spurs our conversation through the rest of this. Thank you. I think that was the end. Yes, that was the end.